This has been a matter of a discussion between Jim and his editor and his lawyer, not his lawyer, their lawyer. And from the time they got the first chapter, they kept telling him it was going to have to be changed. There were going to have to be changes made. It was a book written about a group of men who spoke this way, and if they had said, "Oh, fudge," or "golly gee," people would have found it pretty ludicrous. Others, like Mailer, said, "Oh, fug," and the literary person that Ray was talking about was Tallulah Bankhead, who was one of our most famous and finest actresses in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We didn't have television then, and she was in a radio interview that I just happened to be listening to. And I always admired Tallulah because she was cool. And she said things you weren't supposed to say on the radio. And when I knew she was going to be on, I always tried to listen. But in the interview, she said, "Oh, and by the way, I met Mailer last week." And the guy said, "You did? Where?" She said, "I told him I read it was a cocktail party. I told him I'd read his novel. And I also told him with his education, he should know how to spell fuck." And there was a very deep and prolonged silence on my radio. They said there was. Actually, I was laughing so hard I didn't know if there was or not. But I can believe she said it. I can believe Mailer denied it. And I can believe it really happened. That was one of the words that they thought Jim should try to get rid of. Mitchell once told Jim, "The soldiers I was with didn't speak that way." And Jim said, "Hell no, you were an officer." And that was pure logic to me. I understand that attitude. He may have been wrong, but it made sense to me too. At the time he wrote the book, he was writing about the peacetime army too. And that was even a different group of people. My husband was in the peacetime army, and he knew all the words and what they meant. Mitchell thought it might have been better if he had introduced the words more gradually and let people get used to them a few at a time. And it would be easier for them to accept. When we were reading The Galleys at Loney's, he said, "I didn't use the word fuck till page 26. And I thought, okay, I can believe that. And as I was working on these notes, I thought about that, and I thought, you've never looked to see if it is on page 26. So I went and got my copy of Eternity, and he did use it on page 26. And I didn't look to see if it came before that, nor how many times it came after, because he told me the truth about that word, and I thought that was all the information I needed. So if you want to go home and look on page 26 and From Here to Eternity, believe me, the word is there. They didn't take that one out. He said that he was going to do the best he could to delete the words, and he spent a couple of weeks, or maybe more, with the editors in New York, and they worked on the words. And some of them he didn't care about, that they wanted removed. The things that bothered him the most were complete scenes that they were taking out, that they were getting rid of. He said that there were any number of things that could have been taken from the book that would not have bothered his effort or what he was trying to do, nor even altered the effect. But there was just too many of them that didn't need to be taken out. He wrote a letter to his brother, to Jeff, and said that in the last message he had received, there were 259 fucks, 92 shits, and 5 pricks that they said had to come out. He was astounded they didn't mention a single thing about piss, and he just thought sure that they would have covered that. They also removed a phrase that Jim used on occasion, piece of ass. Every place they took that out, he put it back. They suggested that he said, because he knew that Faulkner had used it in a book and they'd left it in there. And so he wasn't going to let him take it out of his. And they suggested that he say piece of tail, and he said, they don't mean the same thing. And since I didn't use that phrase very often, maybe never, I thought possibly he was right. but he did remove it every time they took it out. In September of 1950, Loney called one afternoon and said that the galley proofs were there, and there was to be one more effort to delete some words. She asked if we could come in and help. There were still more than 350 examples that they wanted Jim to consider getting rid of. After 2 days of reading and discussing around the big table in the handy kitchen and the 2 previous sessions in New York, he finally reached the grand total of 106 F words, 35 S words, and the original 5 P words, because he said there wasn't anything wrong with them, and that was the only word that said what he wanted to say. In a letter to Burroughs Mitchell in March of 1950, Jim said, "One of the things I would like you to remember is that the things we change in this book for propriety's sake will in 5 or 10 years come in someone else's book anyway. And that book may not be as good as this one. And then we'll kick ourselves for not having done it. And we will not have been first with this. And we will wonder why we didn't do it. Writing has to keep evolving into deeper honesty, like everything else. And you cannot stand on past precedent or theory and still evolve. Please remember that. You know there's nothing salacious in my book as well as I do. Therefore, whatever changes you want made along this line will be made for propriety. And propriety is a very inconstant thing. I find this to be one of the best arguments against any type of censorship that has been offered in my lifetime. Jim's feeling was that not one word should be changed for this reason, and they should fight the attorneys all the way. He made many, many changes in the manuscript, but I can vouch for the fact that he fought valiantly and didn't make many of them too. The book was completed in California on February 27th, 1950. There had been a constant effort to change words, phrases, events, and other things that the lawyers feared would keep the book from being published. The censorship laws at that time were very strict, and I'm the first to admit I don't really understand what was going on. We have the First Amendment, so they can't tell us we can't say what we want to say. What they ended up saying was that the post office couldn't mail what we wanted to say, or something to that effect. You could write the book, they could publish the book, but you couldn't get it away from the publisher's door because the mail service would not take it. They were very strict, and they were quite explicit, and Jim fought really hard. And sometimes he won, and sometimes he didn't. They had finally, when the book was published in February of '51, they had finally made him remove a few more words, and he felt that he'd given it his best shot and that he really hadn't lost. Hemingway had always said that he didn't want to be known as a dirty writer. And Jim said, hell, he didn't have any choice but to be a dirty writer, because all he had to work from was his American background. That was his only pattern. And so he accepted the title and decided he couldn't help it. At the time of the publication, the attorney said, I'm sure I can defend this in New York, but I'm still not sure about Massachusetts. I'm sure you know what Jim said. Fuck Massachusetts. And I don't recall, I think at the time the book was not published in Massachusetts, but since then you can buy a copy in any bookstore. He was very busy, and there were many demands on his time after the novel was finished, but he was working on Some Came Running.